It's my duty this morning to mark the presence of a number of people in the hearing room today, in particular the son of His Honour Richard Tracey, Commissioner Tracey, his partner Grace Turner-Mobbs, some members of the judiciary who I can see, the Chief Justice of the Family Court and other colleagues. Thank you for being here this morning. Commissioner Briggs.
It's with a heavy heart that we mark the passing of the Honourable Richard Tracey, a fellow Royal Commissioner and our chair of this Royal Commission. Commissioner Tracey died in California on Friday, where he was taking treatment for cancer, diagnosed only 7 weeks earlier. Richard told a few of us that he had terminal cancer not long after the diagnosis. It came as a total shock, but in true Richard style, he soldiered on and chaired a commissioners' meeting that very same morning. And he spent much of the next month, in fact 5 or 6 weeks, working on our interim report while taking treatment in the United States. It gave us all hope that he would return fit and healthy in the new year. The news of his death was therefore a complete shock and absolutely shattering. Few people ever have the privilege to be a Royal Commissioner, but Richard was made for it. He was experienced, he was wise, he was admired. He knew the law like the back of his hand. He was prepared to take a punt if it meant getting a better outcome for older Australians. He loved his country and he knew a lot about it. Many a time he would explain the history of the area we were visiting or the details of famous cases to me, past and present. I learnt a lot from him, even if I never quite mastered the courtly bow, despite his constant tutelage. Richard was genuinely interested in people and their circumstances. He was such a nice man, and everyone loved him. His kind words to our witnesses after their presentations gave them comfort and let them know that they had been heard. His gentle guidance and direction to the Royal Commission staff always helped and made our collective lives so much easier. He was a thoughtful and considerate man. I loved working with him. It was a genuine partnership. You could say that we bonded over morning teas, simple sandwiches, great fish meals, and iced Vovo biscuits, which Richard lavishly shared with all the staff in the Royal Commission. We will all remember him very well. It was Richard who labelled aspects of the aged care system cruel and unkind after 2 particularly gruelling days of evidence in Darwin. And it was Richard who encouraged me to drive our policy agenda beyond change at the margin to transformative change, given the degree of substandard care that was apparent to us. Our interim report will be his interim report, one of his many legacies. Everyone at this Royal Commission extends their condolences to Richard's wife Hilary and their children, Jack, who's with us here today, Fiona, Philip and Rosie, their families and grandchildren. Our deepest sympathies go out to them. Richard Tracey lived a full and rich life. He will be remembered for his work with the military, as a lawyer educator, as a Queen's Counsel, as a judge and as a Royal Commissioner. But he was also a great family man and a good friend. He was the kindest of men. He was a lovely man. May he rest in peace.
Thank you, Commissioner Briggs. Well, it has been our sad duty to begin this session of the Commission by informing the public that the Honourable Richard Tracey passed away on Friday, Los Angeles time, in Santa Monica, where, as you've heard, he had gone for some medical treatment. Richard was a remarkable man, as everybody who knows him testifies. He was a man who enjoyed life, including many, or at least some, wicked pleasures. He would enjoy a glass of red wine and I can say that he even enjoyed the occasional wicked cigar. I have known him, or known of him, for the whole of my involvement in the law. It was his book on administrative law that I recall reading as a student, and which I then used when I was a lecturer at Monash University. Richard's career in the law has been, indeed Richard's career generally has been remarkable. He was for a time an academic. He served in the Australian Army from 1975 to 2014 and achieved the rank of Major General. He was appointed to Queen's Counsel in 1991. He was Judge Advocate General of the Australian Defence Force from 2007 until 2014. He was President of the Defence Force Disciplinary Appeals Tribunal from 2009 until 2018. He was a Judge of the Federal Court of Australia from 2006 to 2018. And as you know, he was appointed Chair of this Royal Commission on the 6th of December 2018. He had, by any measure, a distinguished career as a lawyer, as a jurist, and I must say, from my experiences of him, he was a remarkable friend. He had a selfless drive and energy which he blended with good humour and compassion. It is no small mark of the man's character that he worked solidly as a judge despite at the time carrying an illness which might have crushed others until remission seemed to have lessened the danger. His work on this commission has also been solid, selfless and significant. I will miss his wise counsel and his warm companionship and like Commissioner Briggs, extend my deepest sympathy to his family. And for those purposes, I include as his family the whole of the members of the Commission. Mr. Rosen.
Thank you, Commissioner McGoney. Richard Tracey was a leader at the bar, on the bench and at our Royal Commission. Fundamentally decent human being whose passing is keenly felt by the council assisting and solicitors assisting teams and all staff at the Aged Care Royal Commission. It is on their behalf that I am privileged to make these remarks. We take the opportunity to express our condolences to Richard's wife and family and to his friends and colleagues, so many of whom are present this morning. Tragically, it's only a little more than 1 year since many of you gathered in this very building for the ceremonial sitting of the full court to farewell the Honourable Justice Tracey. Speakers on that day referred to Richard's remarkable career and his distinguished service to the Federal Court of Australia. They also spoke of Richard's decency and compassion. For those of us who've been fortunate to work with Richard during 2019 at this Royal Commission, it was just these qualities that struck us. His humanity shone most brightly on our site visits, at community forums, and with those whom we refer to as the direct experience witnesses. Some of these witnesses have travelled long distances to give evidence at the Royal Commission. Without fail, Richard, with his characteristic warmth and courtesy, engaged with these members of the public as they shared their often traumatic and distressing experiences with the Royal Commission. In so doing, he displayed the role of a true leader. By his example, he demonstrated to us all how we should treat the members of the public with whom we were dealing, that is, with respect and kindness. Richard was passionate about the work of this important Royal Commission and the need for change in the Australian aged care system. We will miss him. We will continue our work in his absence, but we remain very grateful for the time we had with him. May he rest in peace.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. The Commission will, in a moment, adjourn momentarily to enable those who wish to leave to do so. We thought, though, it might be appropriate to have a minute silence, which we will do in a moment. But just before, I do wish to thank, on behalf of everybody, and Commissioner Briggs as well, those who are present here. I have been looking through the room. I wasn't aware of everybody who was attending. I now see more of you. It's a remarkable feature of his life and his dedication that so many of you have come. I thank you all for being here. I know that there are people watching on the webcast, and thank you very much. I hope that gives some comfort to the members of the family. So we'll have a minute of silence, and then I'll adjourn the hearing. Let's adjourn the hearing momentarily.
The Royal Commission is now adjourned.
one thing in. She was a bit worried about it.
Mr Rosen.
Commissioners, I appear with Mr Paul Bolster, Ms Zoe Maud, Ms Erin Hill and Ms Eliza Bergen. Commissioners, the focus of this hearing is on the aged care workforce. During this 5-day hearing, we'll call 41 witnesses who've made statements and will tender a further 29 statements made by witnesses whom will not be called. To date, Commissioners, the Royal Commission has received 6,631 submissions. Over half of these raised concerns about workforce-related issues. The Commission has had 55 days of hearings, during which 296 witnesses have given evidence. Those witnesses are displayed in the image on the screens. 85% of those witnesses gave evidence about workforce issues. The older Australians and their family members who've given evidence to this Royal Commission have told you about their lack of confidence in the aged care workforce to deliver the safe and high quality care that older people need and deserve. The Commission's heard evidence from people who work in aged care, personal care workers, assistants in nursing, enrolled and registered nurses, nurse practitioners, directors of nursing, allied health workers, general practitioners, clinical consultants, geriatricians, team leaders, residential managers and chief executive officers. To date, 113 witnesses, whose images are now displayed on the screen, have provided the Royal Commission with their perspective of working day to day in aged care. Some of the key workforce challenges identified in that evidence include inadequate numbers and continuity of staff, the adequacy and relevance of training and education, and low pay and limited career paths. You've also heard evidence about difficulties attracting and retaining high quality people to work in aged care and the importance of selecting the right people to work in aged care. Commissioners, we'd like to take this opportunity to revisit some of the evidence you've heard from a selection of our workforce witnesses so far. To do so, we ask the operator to play a video.
Staff don't have time to provide that sort of support for you. So if I need something in the middle of the night, because there's only one nurse responsible for 170 patients, I wait a very, very long time.
Well, we need more people on the floor, and we want those people to be trained to be able to handle and to interact with people, some of whom may have dementia of some kind, but who can still talk to you.
I mean, half the time I will go and visit Dad and there's no one to be seen in his hallway. When people need to go to the bathroom, sometimes they have to wait for 5 or 10 minutes to get someone to attend. There are always sensors kind of pinging. You know, people have sensor mats on their beds. They can be just pinging away, and who knows when someone's actually going to come and attend that. There's just not enough staff.
Although I am aware that he would often be neglected while staff cared for other residents, additionally I had requested from staff a weekly call to keep me updated on my dad's condition and time at the regional facility. However, I never received a call.
There was no one around to help my mum. I ran around the facility doing laps of the corridors trying to find a nurse or just someone to assist. I felt quite panicked at this stage, and my sister and I pretty much were taking turns running around looking for help, and then one of us would stay with mum. This went on for at least 30 minutes before we could find someone to help us. Even when we were able to find people, we felt they did not know how to handle the situation.
It seemed it became a problem, a staffing issue. Did they have the staff that were tall enough or willing enough to bring in even a commode or even walk her to the bathroom? It wasn't going to happen. And she said to me one night she used the diaper And I said, well, Mum, why didn't you ring the bell? She said, I did ring the bell, but nobody came.
In my opinion, there was insufficient staffing at the facility. We are told that everyone is an individual and has to be treated with respect. As care workers, we completely agree with this statement. However, we repeatedly find ourselves with such a heavy workload that we just have to manage a situation that we can't give the residents the time that we would like.
Yeah, most nights I don't leave when at 9 o'clock finish. I'll stay back, and if there's a resident we're halfway through looking after, you just don't leave. You stay there and you finish caring for them.
If you're there by yourself with 40 people and you have 4 call buses going and this lady needs to go to the toilet, you're there with this lady by yourself. The other 3 people, unfortunately, you can't get to when they need they need help. If you've got a person on the floor, you're completely taken off the floor with that person and the registered nurse when they come. Say your other 39, I'm sorry. So you don't know if they're wandering, there's people at risk you're supposed to check, you can't get to them physically.
I would look after 20 to 60 residents. Our care staff have the same volume issues, so we can't give the time and attention that each person deserves.
All the duties that we had to do and the time that was allocated, there wasn't time, and we were discouraged from developing relationships.
We were pretty much classed as multi-skilled. We do the cleaning and the personal care, escorting clients to different appointments. We might get them ready to go on a respite bus for the day. There's meal prep, assisting medication, which is done by the chemist in a Webster pack, for us to assist to make sure that and remind clients to take that medication as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
We need to be actually filling their needs as human beings, and so much time happens where people are sitting alone in a room, or even sitting in a community room where they don't have any interaction with one-on-one with people. And as a person working in dementia care, I find that really confronting and disturbing.
I can be the only person that they will see all week, or 3 times a week, depending on how many times I go to that client. And some of them don't leave their house, so they don't go out anywhere. It's really hard sometimes, because they go there and they want you to stay, they want you to talk to them, and that just to have someone apart from a television talking to them, someone that's going to answer them back, and they'll tell you stories about when they were little.
The problems are 2. One is the hours I've referred to. The other is the variable quality of staff they send. Some of them are largely untrained.
Constant change of worker, so many really unqualified people. They did not know what to do in the house.
What we know from the experts and what we know from other research is that staff that are unable to recognise, unable to manage residents with dementia potentially or often escalate situations. Staff are usually time pressured. The ability to manage someone with dementia requires a certain level of education and training, which I don't believe exists in the personal care workforce, and probably doesn't exist even with the nursing staff, and doesn't exist within the medical staff.
Another area that I think is really important is staff training. Every resident is different. Aged care workers need to be trained to understand how different illnesses work and to understand their different characteristics.
But what I am seeing is that the qualified staff is very limited. So then now you've got trained staff that have just completed university, whether Division 2 or Division 1, being in charge of 30 people. They haven't got the knowledge or the training to deal with the staffing issues, the rostering issues, and directing personal care workers to complete tasks.
I also think that the workforce, I mentioned, the workforce has huge challenges with consistency of staffing, with high levels of casuals, the transient workforce, accessing skilled workers out in rural and remote parts of the country. I think that's an issue.
Comments earlier around attracting people to the workforce is something that's particularly pertinent in these areas, and the message that I would like to get out there is around the amazing experience and challenge that people have in working in these locations. The calibre of the staff that we get out there, we have very committed people that are out there, but it's few and far between that people want to come to these locations.
Yeah, rurally I don't think there's a huge incentive for staff to go other than a small locality allowance. There's not a huge incentive or draw card for professionals to advance their career in the rural areas.
The workforce must be professionalised to improve standards and quality of care. And yes, that means regulation and appropriate funding and remuneration. It means developing proper career pathways to attract and retain the best employees. It is expensive and it's going to become more so as the baby boomers enter the system, but change must come and it must come quickly.
In the model that is currently in the system, I'm not able to use my clinical skills to treat the problems that are at hand in these people. You don't learn or progress in your physiotherapy skills working in aged care, so I think there's a huge lack of motivation, a lack of basically motivation to go into aged care, because people know that they will not be using any of the skills that they have learnt as a physiotherapist to improve people's quality of life. It's very passive. We don't improve function. We don't help people to gain a better sense of independence. And it's almost, when people know, I've spoken to students who are past, present and future about pracs in aged care. Most people do tend to have a practical placement throughout their degree. Everyone it's the worst attitude towards it. So people will just say, I cannot believe that I have to go to this prac for 5 weeks. It's going to be, such a drag. I'm not looking forward to it, because you don't learn anything. It's static, it's passive.
For the work that we do, the pay doesn't reflect that at all. And I'm not saying we're asking for FIFO wages, that would be ridiculous, but it definitely needs to, I've always said it needs to be an industry that wants to attract people, as opposed to people just taking an aged care job because they can't get anything else, or it's just something for them, to pay the bills, because then you could attract the wrong kind of workers, which I'm aware of any industry can. But it needs like a major overhaul.
And it's wages and training, because, as I said, we don't come in this industry to be rich. We come in this industry because we genuinely care about people.
What makes it so rewarding is that you know that you're having a positive impact on each individual's life, daily life, their daily living. And if you can be that one person to make that change on a daily basis, then that's a wonderful outcome. Not only for my personal satisfaction, my professional development, and giving that back to the community, giving that back to the workforce, and also mentoring younger staff members, just the younger generation in general, showing them that aged care it's a great place to be. It is a wonderful place to be. It is so rewarding, and you know what? You just keep going every day.
Commissioners, the Department of Health has conducted a survey of the aged care workforce every 4 years since 2003. The most recent survey was published in March 2017. It described the aged care workforce in 2016. There were approximately 366,000 aged care workers, of whom 235,000 worked in residential facilities and 130,000 worked in home care and home support outlets. The workforce was predominantly female, that is 87%, and the median age was 46 years. A comparison with earlier surveys reveals some important trends. Operator, please display the table from the EGA report. You'll see a table displayed which compares the proportions of the workforce from the surveys conducted from 2003 to 2017. Commissioners, perhaps the most significant trend revealed by the table is the relative decline in the proportion of nurses in the residential aged care workforce and the corresponding increase who are personal care attendants. In 2003, as can be seen, 35.8% of the workforce were nurses. By 2016, this had declined to 24.2%, so from over a third to under a quarter. In the corresponding period, the proportion of workers who were personal care attendants had increased from 56.5% to 71.5%. There's also been a significant decline, as can be seen, in the proportion of the workforce who are allied health professionals, physiotherapists, occupational therapists and speech therapists. And Commissioners, you heard from Ms Irwin, a physiotherapist, in the video that we've just shown about her concerns about working as a physiotherapist in aged care. There's every reason to think that these trends have continued since 2016, although we'll have to wait until 2021 when the 2020 survey results will be released to be certain. This lack of up-to-date data is itself a concern that we'll be examining this week. What is also concerning about these trends is that they've occurred at the same time as the resident cohort have become frailer, older, and in need of higher levels of clinical care. Trends that, on the evidence before this Commission, are set to continue. The consequences of these trends have been revealed in some of the case studies of the Royal Commission. In the Avondrust MyCare case study, which was examined in the Darwin, Cairns and Brisbane hearings, the evidence revealed that a resident at a residential aged care facility, the late Mrs Alberts, received substandard care for a serious leg wound. An investigation by the regulator found that much of that care was provided inappropriately by personal care attendants. The evidence was that despite there being in excess of 60 residents living in the home, on many shifts there was no registered nurse working. A consultant to MyCare calculated that residents were only receiving an average of 7 minutes of care by a registered nurse per day. At that time, the former accreditation standard 1.6 of the Quality of Care Principles 2014 required a provider to ensure that it had appropriately skilled and qualified staff sufficient to ensure the delivery of the necessary care to the residents. The roster at MyCare had been earlier assessed by the Australian Aged Care Quality Agency as meeting Outcome 1.6. This requirement is now found in Standard 7 of the standards that became operational on 1 July this year. We will, during this week, examine these standards and will note the often confusing manner in which they are enforced. We'll ask whether the current standards are capable of ensuring that staffing levels in our aged care homes are appropriate. The vital importance of registered nurses being rostered to work in residential aged care facilities at all times was brought home by a recent coronial case in Victoria. John Reimers died on 17 December 2016 at the Mayflower Residential Aged Care Facility in Reservoir. Mr Reimers had fallen from his wheelchair and his head had become trapped in the bottom drawer of his bedside drawers. In her findings dated 23 August 2019, the coroner found that the enrolled nurse and a personal care attendant on duty had not adequately cared for Mr Reimers between the time of his fall and the time an ambulance attended, by which time Mr Reimers had died. The quality of the first aid he received was inadequate. The coroner found that there was no registered nurse rostered on duty that night, although there was one on call. The coroner questioned both the training of the care worker and the leadership abilities of the enrolled nurse. In handing down her findings, Coroner Jamieson concluded that the circumstances of Mr Reimers' death, and I quote, have highlighted a concerning norm in aged care, staffing to patient ratios administered at minimalistic levels, which places the delivery of appropriate care at risk. Additionally, Her Honour went on, the delivery of appropriate care is being further compromised by an industry approach to employing enrolled nurses to act in charge of their shift. In many cases, the enrolled nurses are supported only by a minimally trained group of care providers who, by their mere dominance of presence in the sector, give the impression that they have the status of a profession. And Commissioners, all of these issues will be explored in the evidence called this week. You'll hear more about these issues, and in particular, evidence will be led about the link between staffing settings and quality of care, changes that may be required to education and training frameworks to improve the quality and safety of aged care, remuneration, working conditions and career pathways, the possible role of registration in workforce reform, innovation and technology relevant for the aged care workforce, and workforce planning. We'll ask the question of many of our witnesses who should be taking responsibility for and stewardship of the aged care workforce reforms. Aged care workers often experience excessive work demands and time pressure to deliver care, as we heard from the witnesses recorded in the video. Other witnesses have told you of the impact of inadequate numbers of staff on people in aged care. Basic standards are often not met. Inadequate staffing levels mean that staff are overworked, rushed and generally under pressure. This impacts on their ability to provide high quality care and on their own health and safety. Later this week you'll hear from Lavina Laboya, an assistant in nursing, about her experience working in a residential aged care facility. Ms Laboya will tell us that she does not have enough time to spend with residents and that she and her colleagues are constantly rushing. This of course is consistent with so much of the evidence we've heard, including that recorded in the video. A number of witnesses before this Royal Commission have argued for the introduction of mandated staffing levels and a skill mix to guarantee a minimum level of care. Other witnesses have raised concerns that mandating staffing levels will not guarantee quality and that staffing stability and continuity are more important and that a more flexible means of ensuring adequate staffing levels is needed. At the Perth hearing in June of this year, Mr Chris Marmarellis of the Widden Group referred to the importance of stable staffing arrangements for the delivery of relationship-centred care. There can be no doubt, however, that staffing is a critical element in ensuring the quality and safety of those in care. Services must have the right number of staff and those staff must have the right skill mix. Workers must have compassion and empathy combined with knowledge of aged care and the illnesses and conditions of those in care. Cathy Eager, Senior Professor and Director of the Australian Health Services Research Institute at the University of Wollongong, will give evidence this morning about how Australian residential aged care staffing levels compare with international and national benchmarks. Professor Eager will refer to groundbreaking work that she co-authored, which was commissioned by the Royal Commission and is available on the Royal Commission website. The report, co-authored by Professor Eager and her colleagues, uses a 5-star rating system to define adequacy of care staffing levels. 1 or 2 stars is characterised by the report authors as denoting unacceptable levels of staffing, and 5 stars is best practice. The report indicates that more than half of all Australian aged care residents are in homes that have 1 or 2 star staffing levels. In other words, Professor Eager's opinion is that more than half of Australia's residential aged care homes have unacceptably low numbers of staff by international standards. On Wednesday, you'll hear from Emeritus Professor Eileen Willis of Flinders University, one of the authors of the National Aged Care Staffing and Skills Mix Project Report 2016. That report was prepared for the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation. Mr Rob Bonner of the Federation will also give evidence. Dr Willis and Mr Bonner will describe the development of the ANMF staffing and skills mix model. We'll also hear from Ms Kim Peake, Secretary of the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services. She'll tell the Commission that Victoria has had legislated mandatory minimum staffing ratios in its public sector residential aged care services since 2015, although ratios have operated under public sector enterprise agreements since approximately 2000. Ms Peake will describe the operation of the Victorian legislation and will explain how high levels of care are provided in Victoria's appropriately staffed homes. She will also explain that the Victorian Government subsidises these homes to the tune of nearly $100 million over and above the Commonwealth subsidies to pay for the additional nurses. During the week, we'll present 2 case studies. In the first of these, tomorrow, we will examine the circumstances of Menarok Aged Care Victoria Limited's Greenway Gardens facility, which was sanctioned in February of this year. You'll hear from family members of residents of Greenway Gardens who will tell you how their loved ones and they themselves were impacted by the failure of Menarok to meet the former accreditation standard 1.6, among other standards. You'll hear from current and former employees of Menarok about how rostering and staffing decisions were made at Greenaway Gardens. we'll ask the directors of Menarok how it is that a residential aged care facility can find itself in a position where it failed to meet standard 1.6 and why this happened. You'll hear from Anne Wunsch of the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission about how the Commission assessed compliance with standard 1.6 in that case. Turning then to training and education. Many workers are not sufficiently trained in how to care for older people with the complex conditions that abound in aged care, such as the various forms of dementia or other age-related illnesses and conditions which affect physical and cognitive functioning. This is particularly concerning given the evidence at the Sydney hearing that the 365,000 people in the population who are currently estimated to be living with dementia will increase to around 900,000 by 2050. Evidence in the Perth hearing revealed that there is also a severe shortage of staff who are qualified and experienced in providing good quality palliative care. At the hearing in Adelaide in February, Mr Sean Rooney of Leading Aged Services Australia gave evidence of a need for subsidies for traineeships for aged care workers and an industry-level capability framework that is linked to the aged care quality standards. He also said the industry should engage more with universities to refocus current nursing education to provide specific aged care educational streams. Also in the first Adelaide hearing, Ms Melissa Code, a representative from United Voice, the union which represents many personal carers in the sector, gave evidence there should be a mandatory minimum qualification to work in aged care. This should be set as an industry standard. Ms Code also called for more opportunities for workers to build and maintain their skills through continuous professional development in areas such as dementia, palliative care and mental health. At the Sydney hearing, we heard evidence that highlights how critical it is that aged care workers understand dementia and how to manage its symptoms. Professor Henry Brodati AO from the University of New South Wales spoke about the inadequacy of dementia knowledge and skills and said that this could be improved by changes to educational curriculum and on-the-job training provided by specially trained professionals. Ms Jennifer Lawrence of Brightwater Care Group noted that good quality aged care, particularly for people with dementia, also requires careful consideration of workers' personal qualities and attributes during selection processes. At the Darwin hearing in July, Ms Sandy Green, a nurse practitioner, said that undergraduate nursing courses often do not provide graduates with basic skills relevant to aged care. And this has been echoed by other witnesses such as medical experts and health professionals who've described specific skill and knowledge gaps in wound care, continence and nutrition. This week we intend to explore the reforms needed in the aged care, vocational education and training and higher education sectors to provide aged care workers with the skills and knowledge to deliver person-centred and specialised care. This will include an exploration of how undergraduate and postgraduate programs for medical practitioners, nurses and allied health professionals can broaden their knowledge and capabilities to support those in aged care. Later today, you'll hear from the role of the vocational education and training sector in relation to the aged care workforce and some of the challenges that that sector faces. We'll receive evidence from Ms Mish Eastman from Swinburne University, Ms Jane Truan of Box Hill Institute and Mr Bonner from the Nursing and Midwifery Federation. On Thursday, you'll hear from a panel of experts on aged care in the higher education sector. They'll be asked what we need to do to ensure that our nurses, doctors, geriatricians and others are appropriately trained to respond to the needs of the growing older population. You'll hear from Ms Rachel Yates of Universities Australia, Professor James Vickers from the University of Tasmania and Adjunct Professor Kylie Ward, the CEO of the Australian College of Nursing. Aged care workers are consistently less well remunerated than their counterparts in related sectors. The 27 legislative review of aged care identified that nurses earn up to 10% less than their counterparts in the acute health sector. And similarly, analysis conducted for the 2018 Aged Care Workforce Task Force identified that nurses and personal carers earn up to 15% less than their counterparts in all other sectors. The uncompetitive wages and conditions in the aged care industry reflect how aged care work is valued. As Lyndall Fowler, whose mother was in aged care, observed in our Darwin hearing, and I quote, "If the pay of people doing the important and challenging work of caring for the most vulnerable people in society, like my mother, is less than someone serving hamburgers, what does that say about our society?" For nurses, there's a potential career pathway through enrolled nursing to registered nursing and potentially to nurse practitioner and other specialist roles. In contrast, career pathways for allied health workers and personal carers in aged care are limited or poorly defined. The issue was examined in depth by the 2018 Aged Care Workforce Task Force, which identified a new aged care job family structure. This morning you'll hear from the chair of this important task force, Professor John Pollaers. The task force proposed that the industry standardise its job classifications, job designs and definitions and career pathways. The ultimate intent of these proposals is to make the aged care industry a viable place to build a longer-term career. On Wednesday, you'll hear evidence about the challenges of improving wages and conditions for the aged care workforce. You'll hear from a panel of industrial officers and representatives from both unions and industry peak bodies. Professor Sarah Charlesworth of RMIT University will provide evidence about the background and history to industrial issues in the aged care workforce. Professor Charlesworth will describe the gendered nature of aged care work undertaken by personal care attendants, and that our understanding of the work done by personal care attendants is premised on the notion that care work is work that women do innately and for free at home. Professor Charlesworth characterises the Commonwealth as effectively the lead employer of aged care, given its pivotal role in the funding of aged care services. And we will explore this observation with a number of witnesses this week. Turning to the role of registration in workforce reform. We've heard evidence of serious misconduct by individual workers who've provided poor quality care or even callously assaulted those in their care, with serious consequences for the residents and their families. This evidence raises the question whether adequate measures exist to ensure that people working in aged care not only have the relevant knowledge and skills, but are people of good character. Ms Code from United Voice has expressed support before this commission for a registration scheme for personal care workers. She cautioned against any minimum qualification-based accreditation scheme, said that it should be free or subsidised given the low pay of those working in the sector. Also in our Adelaide hearing in February, Mrs Barbara Spriggs called for improved means of screening out people who are unsuited to working in aged care because of their character or lack of skills and knowledge. We note, Commissioners, that the Commonwealth, in its post-hearing submissions after the Commission's Brisbane hearing, acknowledged the merit in establishing a register of care workers to identify earlier and more accurately any patterns of reportable assaults committed by the same care worker. On Thursday, in the second of our case studies, we'll examine how approved aged care provider Japara Healthcare Limited managed an employee who it had found had engaged on several occasions in serious misconduct directed at several vulnerable residents over a considerable period of time. We've chosen not to name the employee in this hearing, as he has not been the subject of any court findings. The misconduct concerned the employee's interaction with and handling of residents. After he left the employ of Japara, under the current law, he remains free to work elsewhere in the aged care sector and, in fact, in other caring sectors. And you will hear from witnesses that this is far from an isolated case. We'll ask whether there should be a means by which such a person should be excluded from working in the aged care sector as a result of substantiated findings of misconduct, and if so, what form such a scheme should take. We'll explore current mechanisms to respond to concerning behaviour by healthcare workers, namely the Code of Conduct for health workers. You'll hear evidence from the Victorian and Queensland health complaints entities about how they are implementing that Code of Conduct. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission will explain the manner in which it works with the various health complaints entities to respond to concerns about healthcare workers in aged care. We anticipate that ultimately we'll be submitting to you that the current arrangements are far from adequate to protect our elderly. Turning to workforce planning, it's notable that in 2011 the Productivity Commission estimated that by 2050 the aged care workforce will need to have grown to around 980,000 workers. That is somewhere near triple our current workforce. Providers will need to adopt new models of care and scopes of practice to meet changing expectations. And they'll need to be imaginative about how they use technology. Aged care is part of the healthcare and social assistance sector, which has been the largest growing industry every year in Australia since 2015. According to 2017 government research, employment for personal care workers will increase by nearly 30% in the 5 years to May 2023. In the same period, the overall projected growth for all occupations is 7%, 7.1%. The aged care sector is competing for its workforce with other parts of the health and social assistance sector, especially the disability sector. There are already staff shortages. We'll tender a witness statement from Tony Hawkins of the Esperance Aged Care Facility in rural Western Australia. Ms Hawkins' evidence is that the Esperance Aged Care Facility constructed a new wing recently at a cost of $7.1 million to accommodate additional residents, but it cannot recruit the additional 40 staff required to open the wing. Our evidence is that the wing remains closed. A vital issue for consideration in this hearing is where does responsibility for workforce planning lie? What are the respective roles of industry and the government, and who's taking the lead on workforce planning to ensure that we have a capable workforce to meet the growing demand in aged care? We'll explore these issues with witnesses from the Department of Health and with Kevin McCoy, who's the Acting Chair of the Aged Care Workforce Industry Council. You'll hear that that council is charged with implementing the 14 strategic actions identified in the June 2018 Task Force report. You'll hear that the council is made up of highly motivated members, but has concerns about the support that it's getting from the Commonwealth Government. In addition, on Thursday, you'll hear from a panel of Chief Executive Officers of aged care providers. We'll ask those CEOs about how they are engaging in workforce planning within their organisations. We'll also explore with them the challenges associated with attracting and retaining staff with the right skills and aptitude. You've heard evidence from witnesses previously that this is a challenge in many parts of the aged care sector. We'll ask the question, why do we need to care about the people who themselves are providing care? Commissioners, there can be no doubt that the quality of care that older people receive depends on the quality of the people who provide it. What we expect of care providers and how we support them and those working in aged care reflects on how the Australian community views ageing and our elders, and the value we place on compassion, individual freedom, dignity and fairness. We need to inspire people to want to care for our elders and enable them to enhance their life through great quality care. Commissioners, we need more people like Sheree Johnson of the Larrakia Corporation, who told us in the Darwin hearing of her love for working with the elders in her community and the joy of working in aged care generally. She was, you may recall, the last person depicted in the video that we displayed earlier. Australia needs a sufficient and stable supply of well-trained and motivated doctors, nurses, allied health professionals and personal care workers to deliver quality care and provide stability and certainty for our elderly. People in aged care should be confident about the skills and abilities of those who are caring for them. They should feel secure and safe regardless of where they receive that care. Commissioners, from the evidence to date, a picture is emerging of an aged care sector struggling to attract, train, retain and sustain its workforce. This is not a new issue, and you'll hear that, as with so many other aspects of aged care, it's been the subject of numerous previous reports. As was observed in our first hearing in Adelaide, this Royal Commission is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make substantial reforms for this vital sector. Nowhere is the need for reform more pressing than in relation to the aged care workforce. Our final witnesses on Friday will be the Secretary of the Department of Health, Ms Glenys Beecham, together with Mr Charles Wan, also of the Department. In this evidence, we'll examine many of the issues canvassed in this opening and in the running of the hearing. We'll examine the contribution, role, responsibilities and leadership of the Department concerning the aged care workforce. Over the course of the week, in combination with what the Royal Commission has already heard about the state of the aged care sector, we'll seek an answer to this question. Who will take responsibility for and stewardship of aged care workforce reforms? However, not only do we need responsibility and stewardship, in light of the raft of inquiries, reviews and recommendations in relation to aged care in recent years, we need proper accountability for aged care workforce reform. As Professor Pelares explained in his foreword to the Task Force report, and I quote, "The way we care for our ageing is a reflection of who we are as a nation. How we care says who we are." Commissioners, what is abundantly clear from the video that you've seen earlier and the evidence that we've heard this year is that there are thousands of people working in aged care who display selfless devotion to those for whom they care every day. They are looking after the most intimate needs of some of our most vulnerable citizens. They do it for little money, they're often inadequately supported, at times they risk their own health and safety. They do all of this with love and dedication. We are all in their debt. They deserve appropriate remuneration, appropriate training and support and safe workplaces. Commissioners, before I call the first witness and tender the tender bundle, I understand there are parties who wish to announce their appearances. It may be an appropriate time for that to occur.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen.
Commissioner Morgan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Is it?
Civil.
Thank you.
If it's suitable to the Commission, I'll call the first witness at this time.
Yes, that's Professor Eager, is it?
It is. I call Professor Kathy Eager.
I solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Professor Eager, for the purposes of the transcript, can you please state your full name?
Kathleen Margaret Eager.
And you are Professor and Director of the Australian Health Services Research Institute at the University of Wollongong.
That's correct.
And for the purposes of the Royal Commission, Professor Eager, you have prepared a witness statement dated the 4th of October 2019.
Correct.
And that is coded WIT.0459.0001.0001.
Correct.
That's right. Have you had an opportunity to read through your statement before coming along giving evidence this morning?
I have.
And is there anything in the statement that you would like to change?
No,
And are the contents of the statement true and correct?
they are.
And where you express opinions in that statement, are they opinions that you honestly hold?
They are.
Commissioners, I neglected to tender the general tender bundle. I think that should perhaps be the first exhibit.
Yes.
I can indicate for the record that it has 204 tabs.
Yes, I think we should, if we can, just indicate what it is with sufficient specificity so that we don't get a mistake on the transcript. So the tender bundle...
We're calling it the general tender bundle to distinguish it from the case study tender bundles, which will be separately tendered.
I follow that. And is there a... I don't have it in front of me, but do we have a date or something that we can...
It can probably bear today's date. It's an iterative document, and it'll probably be added to over the course of the week.
Well, the general tender bundle then will be exhibit 11-1.
Pleases. And I would tender the statement of Professor Eager as 11-2. That's dated the 4th of October 2019, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. That'll be exhibit 11-2.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Professor Eager. A bit of housekeeping which I should have attended to earlier. My apologies. I can start, Professor, by asking you a little bit about the institute that you are the director of. You do set that out for us in your statement at paragraph 8 through to 11. Perhaps I can just ask you to very quickly just summarise the role of the institute and the work that it does.
The Institute was 25 years old last year, and we're not a traditional medical research institute. We do health services research. So we do research into how the health and human services systems work and how to improve them. And the focus of our work is quite diverse, reflecting key issues really at this commission: safety, quality, access, efficiency, and so on. We have a very well-established group of about 60 researchers working across 6 research centres. 3 of those are the national outcome centres, patient-reported outcome centres in palliative care, rehabilitation and chronic and persistent pain, as well as the National Case Mix and Classification Centre and the Centre for Health Service Development, which is the centre that's done the report we're talking about today.
And you indicate, and I'll come to that report presently, and you indicate in your statement that the Institute has considerable experience and expertise, not just in health generally, but in relation to aged care services.
That's right, and I think we would be recognised as one of the national and international leaders more generally in subacute care and in non-acute care, and we did our first related study in this area back in 1994.
Yeah. Now, you've been the director of the Institute since 1998, and if I could turn to your own personal and professional qualifications, which are also set out in detail in both your statement and an attachment to it, and I won't go to those in any detail, but I note from paragraph 4 that you hold various qualifications, which we needn't go through, including a PhD in public health. At paragraph 5 of your statement, I note that you've been awarded a number of honours, and I take it they're honours that you consider relevant to the work that you've done for us in the statement.
I do.
Once again, I don't think we need to read those out. For the sake of completion, if I could ask the operator to bring up tab 149 of Exhibit 11.1, the General Tender Bundle. You've included for us there your CV, is that right?
That's
Professor?
correct.
And if I may say so, it's a very extensive document and lists several hundred publications that you've either authored or co-authored in the period since 1990.
That's correct.
Any reason why you chose 1990 as a cut-off date?
We didn't have good computerisation before then.
Right, so records are a bit sketchy before then.
Sketchy before then.
The good old days, Professor.
That's right.
Sadly, some of us remember them all too well. I want to ask you a little bit more about your background, if I could. We've got your professional background set out at paragraph 6 of your statement. You note that prior to your time working in academia, you worked in clinical and management roles in the New South Wales health system.
That's right. I spent the first 10 years or so working in clinical roles. I trained as a psychologist. I then moved into management positions in both Western Sydney and in the Illawarra. And then I gradually got interested in those roles, in what is the evidence about how to improve services. And it was really through the lens of having worked as a senior manager and an executive by that stage, senior executive in the health system, that I decided that I was really going to, if nobody else knew the evidence, I was going to go and find it.
I'll presently ask you about a report that you've prepared for the Royal Commission, and reference has already been made to that in the opening statement. I think you were in the room when I made that statement. Before I do that, I need to ask you about some previous work that was carried out by the Institute, which goes by the title of the Resource Utilisation and Classification Study, which is abbreviated as the RUCS work. You explain that study at paragraphs 12 to 20 of your statement, and as briefly as we can, I wonder if I could put some propositions to you which I suggest summarise the work that you did, and you can tell us if you're satisfied that that's a sufficient and accurate summary of that work. So firstly, the work was done between 2017 and February of this year.
Correct.
And the client was the Commonwealth Department of Health.
Correct.
Before 2017, your institute had prepared a report which concluded that the aged care funding instrument was no longer fit for purpose.
That is correct.
And the aged care funding instrument is abbreviated as ACFI, and there's been a lot of evidence in this commission about ACFI. And a number of deficiencies were identified with ACFI, but at its heart was a concern that ACFI doesn't discriminate satisfactorily between residents about what drives their care needs and what predicts the cost of that care.
Yes, we had a number of concerns. One was about its inefficiency. The second set of concerns were about the perverse incentives that it creates in the system. And the third is that it's actually not a very good funding instrument, in that funding should be aligned with care needs of residents. And people getting the same amount of funding had vastly different needs. And we needed an instrument that resulted in people with the same needs getting the same level of funding.
The RUCS study was aimed at a number of things. Firstly, identifying the characteristics of aged care residents that influence the cost of their care. Is that right?
That's correct.
Secondly, identifying which of those costs were shared costs and which were individual costs.
That's correct.
And could you give us an example in an aged care setting of a shared cost?
Roughly half of the costs of time are shared between all residents equally. So that's the night staff, the staff in the dining room supervising a meal, brief encounters, in the corridors, social activities. Only about 50% of the costs are identified as being individual to individual residents. So the 50% are shared equally and all residents benefit from them.
And those individual costs might be showering a particular resident, for example.
Absolutely. Managing activities of daily living, cognitive problems, behaviour, medications and so on.
And then the third, and this is a summary obviously, but the third task of the RUC study was to develop a case mix classification system which could underpin a funding model addressing both shared and individual costs of care.
That's correct.
This notion of a case mix classification system, I think well understood in the health sector, not necessarily so well understood outside. Can you assist us, please, in understanding what that means? What does the expression case mix mean in that context?
The ACFI is what we call an additive model. You assess a person, you add up the scores, and the more scores, the more money. A case mix classification uses a really different set of logic. It starts by saying, what is it about this resident that drives their need for care, and why does resident A need more care than resident B? In the case mix classification we did in the residential aged care sector, the single best predictor of need for care is a resident's mobility. People who are independently mobile need very different volume and type of care than people who have assisted mobility versus those people who can't move around in bed at all. We created a case mix classification, so a classification where at the first level residents are classified according to their mobility, and then it goes down different branches of the classification based on the attributes for that type of resident that drives their need for care. For example, for the cohort who can't reposition in bed, the major determinants then are risk of pressure areas, whereas for the assisted mobility group, the single best predictor for that cohort is their cognitive function.
So thank you. If we just go back to the notion of case mix, it's literally a mix of cases.
A mix of cases where people are assigned to a case mix class based on their need for care and the cost of that care, and where the goal is that all the residents in a particular class need roughly the same care and the same cost of that care.
So we can just take a simple example. The class might be elderly people with dementia, for example. That could be a class.
Well, dementia per se is not a cost driver. Dementia results in cognitive, behavioural decline and inability to manage activities of daily living. And so the classes are defined that way. We do have one class for palliative care. There are 13 classes. The other 12 classes are defined by mobility, cognitive impairment, behavioural disturbance, pressure, skin problems and related. So a class might be people with assisted mobility who have poor cognitive function and with other compounding factors.
It might be of assistance if we can just at the moment leap forward to the report, which I'm going to ask you about a bit more detail, which is behind tab 148 in the General Tender Bundle, Exhibit 11.1. And if we could go to page .0013, please, operator. And if we can highlight the third paragraph on that page, please. I hope that's visible on the screen in front of you, Professor. What is noted there in the report is that the absence of a case mix adjusted funding model in aged care in Australia to date means there is currently no objective mechanism to identify the most appropriate staffing levels for different client cohorts or groups, or to adjust for regional differences that may impact on staffing availability. If I could just pause there in the reading. That's a reference to ACFI not being a case mix funding mechanism. Is that
That's right. One of the criticisms of staff ratios has been it's too blunt an instrument, people have very different needs and you can't just have a one-size-fits-all. With a case mix classification, you can actually say people in this class need twice as much care as people in another class.
Yes.
So you start to create a way of better describing what individuals need. The technical performance for the classification is assessed by looking at the coefficient of variation. It's a statistic that looks at how homogenous the groups are. In the ANAC, the classification we developed, the coefficients of variation of all the classes are really quite good. The groups are quite homogenous with respect to their staff time requirements.
We'll come back to that in a moment if we may, but if we can just go back to the RUCS project, and probably the simplest thing is to go back to your statement, Exhibit 11.2, please, operator, on page .0003, paragraph 16. We can see at the bottom of the page that the RUCS study comprised 4 separate but closely related studies that are set out in your statement. Is that right?
That's correct.
For our purposes, we probably only need to focus in on studies 1 and 2. I see you're nodding, so I'm pleased about that.
Yep.
And if I can summarise those studies, study 1 was a detailed time and motion study of the care needs of 1,877 residents of 30 facilities.
That's correct.
Is that right? And we can see on page 4 of your statement at the bottom of the page some data which emerged in a table format from study 1.
Mm-hmm.
And are there aspects of that, Professor, that you think are significant for present purposes?
I think the most important point to make is that overall the split of time was about 50% individual, 50% shared, but that does vary by professional group. The registered nurses, who are the group that a lot of people have been concerned about, spending more of their time on shared activity versus individual. And a lot of the concerns raised at the Commission is about the inadequacy of individualised time from registered nurses. That reflects in part some of the dead weight of the paperwork systems in the aged care sector and other administrative tasks, particularly compliance with ACFI.
We might come back to that as well, but we see that if we look at the last column there, the percentage of total staff time, that is personal care assistant time, is 74%.
That's right. And this is time on the floor, not just this doesn't include the people back at the head office.
Yes, yeah. I note that figure in general terms is very close to the figure I cited earlier in the opening about the proportion of the workforce that are personal care
That's
workers.
correct.
That's also about 3/4.
That's right.
Whereas the proportion of the workforce that are nurses is a great deal more than 9%, isn't it? And is that a reflection of the point you just made earlier, that so much of the nurse's time is taken up by other activities, not direct care work?
Yeah, we're very confident about that this was a really resource-intensive study.
Yes.
The staff in the study had a barcode scanner on a lanyard around their neck, and they literally swiped time in minutes with each resident each day for each of the activities they did. And they did that for 30 consecutive days.
And how were the 30 facilities chosen for that study?
That particular study was a cluster study, 10 facilities in far north Queensland, 10 in the Hunter region in New South Wales and 10 in metropolitan Melbourne. They were chosen to be representative of the range of services across the country. So the North Queensland had a good representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents and, in fact, homes. The Hunter had a range of called residents, etc. So that the Melbourne one, we clustered them, though, because we needed to support them. We had our members of our team in there every day with those homes. This was really resource intensive. They did a fantastic job, but they are representative of homes as a whole. The other thing I would say about that is that having done a random selection to ensure that they were a representative section, we then eliminated any home that there were concerns about. So if a home was under sanction, they were not included in our study. If anybody had raised concerns about a home, they were not included. we were capturing current average practice, but we were not wanting to reinforce bad practice by building that bad practice into the results of our study.
So that's study 1. If we can go briefly to study 2, which is summarised at the top of page 4 of your statement, if the top paragraph could please be highlighted, operator. Study 2 is a fixed and variable cost analysis study.
That's correct.
And it looked at a sample of 89 facilities across Australia. How were those 89 chosen?
They were a random selection to represent Australia, so we had a sampling framework where the strata in the framework were location, both state and territory, but also metropolitan, regional, remote, size, large, small, etc., ownership stream. So we had government, not-for-profit and for-profit. And again, the purpose was to be a representative sample where we could then draw conclusions about aged care as a whole. We did deliberately oversample the 20, we put in the 20 most remote services in Australia because they're very small volume, and so we deliberately oversampled them, and then we weighted our results at the end to deal with that.
Now, that 89 was a representative sample out of, what, 2,500?
2,500.
Facilities?
That's right.
Right. And as you've explained, you develop strata. It's known as a stratified sample,
yes.
Isn't it? And
yes,
that's a
right.
statistical term, meaning what there are layers with.
There are layers.
Yes.
So you're selecting a sample which has subpopulations so that you can draw conclusions about each of the subpopulations as well as the sector as a whole.
Now, importantly, we need to appreciate, don't we, that the data that was the subject of the analysis was financial activity and facility profile data that you were
That's
looking
correct.
at, and it was for the 18-month period, July 2016 to December 2017.
That's right. And in the analysis of the results today, we included the last 12 months only.
Right, so that is, what, December 2016 to
That's
December
correct.
2017. And it's important that we understand that, because this is the data that you have relied upon in relation to the most recent report that you've done for
That's
us.
correct.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned earlier ANAC, another acronym that we need to be familiar with, the Australian National Aged Care Classification System. That was the outcome of the RUCS
Yes, the
project.
major outcome of the RUC study was a new classification termed the Australian National Aged Care Classification, and an associated set of recommendations about what the funding model should look like. There were 30 recommendations in total.
And that was the system that assigns a resident to a payment class based on their need for care and its cost.
That's correct.
And they're the 13 categories that you spoke of a little earlier in your evidence.
There's one class for palliative care, 2 classes for residents who are independently mobile, 5 classes for people requiring assistance with mobility, and 5 for people who cannot mobilise.
If we can go to paragraph 20 of your statement, please, which appears on page 6, you inform the Commission there that the RUCS study produced 7 reports.
That's correct.
And we see them identified. We don't need to go through each of them one at a time. At paragraph 21, you note what may seem an obvious proposition, but no doubt is an important one, that the purpose of staffing a residential aged care facility is to meet the physical, social and emotional needs of residents, and accordingly you say any consideration of staffing levels and mix must take into account the care needs of residents. What's the significance of those observations for the Royal Commission, Professor?
I know it looks self-evident that the purpose of staffing is to meet the needs of residents, but I think often staffing has become an ideological debate about models of care and other sorts of considerations and making the dollar stretch rather than about meeting care needs. And I'm not proposing a total dependency model, although this is a very dependent profile. I'm also talking about people's strengths and their aspirations and their appetite for risk. And that's all part of meeting people's social and emotional needs as well as their physical care needs.
Now, if I could just go back to the RUC studies, at their heart was an assessment by your team of the care needs of residents, and you utilised a RUC's assessment tool.
That's correct.
And that was a tool that was designed by the team together with 4 national expert clinical panels.
That's right. We convened 4 expert panels
Yes.
who were experts in nursing, pain, function, cognition, behaviour, and palliative care.
And as you explain in paragraph 23, the assessments provided strong independent evidence of the care needs of approximately 5,000 residents who were assessed during 2018.
That's correct.
And that number of 5,000 we get if we add together the number that were examined in RUC Study 1 and RUC Study 3.
That's
Is
correct.
That right? And you say in paragraph 23 that that cohort is a representative sample of residents living in residential aged care across Australia in 2018. How can you be confident of its representative nature?
Because of the way that we selected our sample and the stratification we had. The department provided us with a list of all residential aged care facilities in Australia, and we used that list for sampling.
At paragraph 25, you note that the overall finding from the RUCS study is that residents are typically very frail with significant care needs. And you note some specific findings from Study 1 and Study 3 to illustrate this conclusion, and they're included in the following paragraphs of your statement. Could I just ask you to explain in general terms the various domains that were analysed to reach that conclusion? What is it about the residents that you were examining?
We assessed each resident independently by assessors that we selected and trained for that purpose, and they were asked to assess what a resident is capable of doing, taking into account not just their physical conditions, but also their behaviour, their cognitive status, mental health issues, motivation, etc. And the domains that were important were the ones identified by our international evidence and by experts, and essentially that was mobility, ability to manage activities of daily living, cognitive and communication ability, frailty, palliative care, end-of-life needs, the risk of pressure injuries, and mental health and behaviour.
Now you have, and we're grateful for this, prepared a number of slides which depict some of these findings. Would it be convenient for those to be brought up at this point, Professor, and you may find it easier to give this part of your evidence by reference to these slides?